Was 19th century evolutionary thought connected to ideas of progress?
Not directly, because evolution was an external force, whereas progress depended on individual human effort. But the two notions were frequently associated, as in the ideas of American industrialist Andrew Carnegie. In general, notions of progress formed both ideals and practical motivations. Society as a whole was believed to be progressing, and individuals were motivated to advance in life by becoming materially prosperous. The prosperity of society was largely believed to be a matter of technology. The 19th century was the first full-fledged machine age, and it saw the inventions and wide use of the cotton gin, locomotive, telegraph, and electric lights, to name just a few.
What was dogmatism?
Dogmatism, then and now, was the position that there is at least one true thing about the world that we can know with absolute certainty.
Who are some key feminist philosophers of science?
Sandra Harding, 1935, addresses questions of whether women have privileged ways of knowing. In Third World, as well as Euro-American societies, whether the exclusion of women from science can be corrected within science, and whether scientific knowledge is itself misogynistic.
Who was Jane Addams?
Jane Addams, 1860 to 1935, was the first woman public intellectual in the United States. She was a close colleague of both John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, and George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931. In 1931, Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her progressive public activities in beginning the settlement house movement. The settlement movement involved locating places for assisting members of impoverished immigrant communities, directly in their neighborhoods. Addams began the services of Hull House with art appreciation classes and quickly developed a program of education for youth, child care, instruction in domestic skills, and adult education. She was only recovered as a philosopher and feminist in the late 20th century. Her main works include Democracy and Social Ethics, 1902, Newer Ideals of Peace, 1906, 20 Years at Hull House, 1910, and Second 20 Years at Hull House, 1930. The Long Road of Woman's Memory, 1916, and Peace and Bread in Time of War, 1922.
What was George Santayana's contribution to pragmatism?
Other than the fact that Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, was his teacher, and C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, argued against his intuitive theory of knowledge. It is not always clear how Santayana was a pragmatist. The philosophical convention places him within that group. Mostly due to time and place and the pragmatist philosophers he interacted with while living in the United States. Still, Santayana's ideas about aesthetics, reason, philosophy itself, and human nature share a common spirit with William James, 1842 to 1910, and John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Santayana's theory of aesthetics was that beauty is the experience of pleasure in the form of an object, rather than the effects on the sense organs of the person experiencing the artwork. He claimed that all preference is basically irrational and that values are based on pleasure. His take on reason emphasized human creativity in science, religion, society, and ordinary life, as well as more obviously in art. Overall, he identified human beings as animals, inhabiting a physical world, oriented toward food, and fearful of danger. Santayana thought that nature was a kind of backdrop within which we have our experience. In The Life of Reason, 1905 to 1906, he described nature as drawn like a sponge, heavy and dripping from the waters of sentience. The nature of nature is thus conditioned by our experience of it. These views characterize his early work. After he left Harvard, Santayana wrote about metaphysics and ontology, emphasizing objective reality as opposed to human experience. But Santayana himself did not acknowledge this change in his subject matter, and in his later writing he claimed to be providing a more comprehensive and rigorous foundation for his earlier theories of art and experience.
Who was John Dewey?
John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Was the most famous philosopher in the United States during the early 20th century. He was a public intellectual during the decades when ordinary people, as well as intellectuals, filled halls to hear intellectually stimulating and edifying speeches. His interactive, pragmatic approach to ordinary life, education, and art appreciation has shaped American experience in fundamental ways that do not always refer to him by name. Although, or because, Dewey was shy, he wrote 37 books and more than 700 articles. His main publications include Psychology, 1887, Human Nature and Conduct, 1922, Experience and Nature, 1925, The Public and Its Problems, 1927, The Quest for Certainty, 1929, Philosophy and Civilization, 1932, A Common Faith, 1934, Art as Experience, 1934, Liberalism and Social Action, 1935, Logic, The Theory of Inquiry, 1938, Freedom and Culture, 1939, and Problems of Men, 1946.
When and how did the scientific revolution begin?
The scientific revolution began with Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. Heliocentric theory and the rediscovery of ancient Greek atomism in the 15th and 16th centuries. But it was not until the end of the 17th century, after Isaac Newton's, 1643 to 1727, work, that it was clear to educated people in Europe that a full-blown scientific revolution had occurred.
What are the philosophical issues about racial identity?
They come down to the question of whether African Americans should envision themselves and their communities as race-specific or generically American. Traditionally, strong racial or ethnic identities have developed among members of oppressed groups, sometimes based on the very things that are used against them by racists. On the other hand, strong racial identities among disadvantaged groups may prevent young people from aspiring to and achieving success in a dominant white society. Beyond these pragmatic concerns is a current consensus that all social and psychological racial identities are socially constructed, rather than biologically determined.
How did ideas about life change when it came to the philosophy of science?
Many notions of a mysterious vitalism, or life force, at the heart of the reproduction of living beings were exchanged for materialist physical accounts after James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix in 1953. Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA took the mystery out of the idea of life because it could account for the reproduction of genetic material in purely chemical terms. The double helix was a three-dimensional model of the twisted ladder structure of deoxyribonucleic acid DNA, which showed how sequences of acids and bases would replicate themselves through chemical reactions. Watson and Crick's discovery paved the way for gene-based studies in heredity, culminating in the mapping of the human genome, totality of genes, by the early 21st century.
What is the causal theory of meaning?
This theory was first developed by Paul Kripke, 1940. Keith Donnellan, 1931, and Hilary Putnam, 1926, in the 1970s. There used to be a distinction between denotative and connotative, or intentional, with an S, which is different from intention with a T, meaning. Denotative meaning was the thing or types of things in the world to which a word referred. Connotative or intentional meaning was the conditions of application of a word or the definition of the word in other words. According to the causal theory of meaning, also known as the causal theory of reference, there is a causal history that makes proper names the names of the individuals they are, something like a baptism. Natural kind terms, such as water and gold, work in much the same way. To take an example, the term water designates the natural H2O. If a substance were called water that was not H2O, it would not be water. Putnam famously said of meanings in this regard that they just ain't in the head. Articles by Kripke, Donnellan, and Putnam on this subject appear in Naming. Necessity and Natural Kinds, 1977, edited by Stephen P. Schwartz.
Who was Ernest Nagel?
Born in Czechoslovakia, Ernest Nagel, 1901 to 1985. Lived in the United States after 1910 and was a member of the Columbia University Philosophy Department for over 40 years. His The Structure of Science, 1961. Is probably the last important logical positivist account of scientific investigation. Nagel extended the principles of the covering law model, whereby explanation is based on a generalization that has been inductively built up, for the social sciences. He argued that although historical events are unique and non-recurring, historical explanation implies that such events would happen again, given the same conditions and proven generalizations.
How has Jacques Derrida's post-structuralism been received?
Derrida's contemporary Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, who many have regarded as a structuralist, accused him of practicing a terrorism of obscurantism. Foucault meant that those who could not understand Derrida, that is, most of his philosophical contemporaries, were attacked by Derrida as idiots. American philosophers such as Noam Chomsky, 1929, John Searle, 1932, and Richard Rorty, 1931 to 2007, have mocked and dismissed Derrida. Searle referred to the deliberate obscurantism of the prose, the wildly exaggerated claims, and the constant striving to give the appearance of profundity by making claims that seem paradoxical, but under analysis often turn out to be silly or trivial. Chomsky thought that Derrida's work was typical of the local eccentric tradition of Parisian intellectuals, without it being an explicit issue for them. Chomsky and Searle assume that meaning itself is stable and their theoretical work proceeds on that basis. However, Rorty, who has claimed that it might be impossible to understand Derrida's metaphysics, has a view similar to Derrida's about the false pretensions to truth that philosophers entertain.
How is Boethius' consolation of philosophy both Stoic and Neoplatonic?
The Consolation of Philosophy was written as a dialogue in which Boethius, 480 c. 525, in despair, is visited by philosophy in the form of an uplifting and encouraging angel.
Who were the natural philosophers?
Natural philosophy was the term used to describe what we now call science. The key players in the scientific revolution, beginning with Galileo, 1564 to 1642, and ending with Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727, were called natural philosophers and were revered as geniuses by philosophers of their day. The lines between scientific inquiry, philosophical theories of knowledge, and philosophy of science were not clearly drawn until these natural philosophers' discoveries and theories helped define them.
What is phenomenalism?
Not to be confused with phenomenology, phenomenalism is the empiricist doctrine that sense data, or the sensory organ's impression of perception, could be used to explain the meaning of sentences about perceptual objects. Some believed that perceptual objects themselves, such as a computer, a desk, or a car, could be reduced to sense data. This last ontological version of phenomenalism would involve a general commitment to philosophical idealism, or the doctrine that the only things that are real are mental phenomena.
Why did Sokal do this?
He explained it this way: I'm an unabashed old leftist who never quite understood how deconstruction was supposed to help the working class. And I'm a stodgy old scientist who believes, naively, that there exists an external world, that there exist objective truths about that world, and that my job is to discover some of them. In other words, besides thinking that, and showing how postmodern thought was of poor intellectual and scholarly quality, Sokal did not believe it served a worthy political purpose. Sokal, along with Jean Bricmont, a physicist, professor and philosopher of science, further developed the critique implied by Sokal's article in their book Fashionable Nonsense, 1997.
What was impressive about Averroes' life and work?
Averroes, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born into a prominent family of lawyers and judges, and was himself trained as a lawyer in both civil and religious affairs. He traveled from Córdoba to Marrakesh in 1153 and decided that Aristotle had been correct in stating that the world was round when he was able to observe Canope, a star not visible in Spain. He served as both advisor and doctor to the Sultan of Marrakesh, who encouraged a series of commentaries on Aristotle. His writings include treatises on medicine and astronomy, but he is best known for his The Incoherence of Incoherence, which was a reply to Al-Ghazali's, 1058-1111, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In his Incoherence of Incoherence, Averroes defended natural reason as a means to attain knowledge in all domains. By natural reason Averroes, and others after him, meant ordinary thought processes rather than religious intuition or revelation. Averroes also wrote a set of commentaries on Aristotle that was influential in Western medieval scholarship. When his interpretations of Aristotle did not square with his own assumptions, he wrote detailed supplements of his own. For example, Aristotle's Physics and On the Heavens were composed as two separate works and based on different types of observations. Under Plato's influence, Averroes assumed that they were united.
What was Scottish common sense philosophy?
It was the realist view of human knowledge put forth by Thomas Reid, 1710-1796, that what we know are real objects in the world and not our ideas, as claimed by David Hume, 1711-1776.
What was Henry David Thoreau's philosophical contribution?
Henry David Thoreau, 1817-1862, was a naturalist, writer, school teacher, and pencil maker. He invented the pencil with an eraser on its end. He was born in Concord, Massachusetts, attended Harvard, and then returned to Concord. He was not a political reformer but is famous for his civil disobedience in not paying the poll tax. He felt it supported slavery and the Mexican-American War, both of which he found objectionable, and for helping runaway slaves escape. Thoreau is best known for the 2 years he spent in a hut he built on Walden Pond, an experience he describes in Walden, 1854. His lifestyle there and protest against materially driven lives of quiet desperation set an aesthetic ideal for many American intellectuals in generations to come. Thoreau's love of nature and ideals of simplicity were in themselves a form of revolt against industrial life and have been reclaimed in intellectual revolts against post-industrial life. However, Thoreau's striking intellectual contribution is not the ideal of roughing it in nature. Because his time at Walden Pond, punctuated as it was by frequent visits from his literary friends, as well as his own habit of walking back into town, was hardly a withdrawal from society. Indeed, the hardships he endured scarcely compared with the hardships of pioneers and homesteaders farther west, who lived in rural poverty out of necessity rather than choice. By contrast, Thoreau set a different example for a different American group of strivers. He combined a naturalistic aesthetic of simplicity with cultural criticism and intellectual creativity. This life of the mind in the woods stands in stark social class and regional contrast to the genuinely Hardscrabble background of several of the early 20th century pragmatists, as well as with their efforts.
Who was Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach?
Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach. 1804 to 1872, criticized German idealism as a form of theology, or a rationalization of religion. His project was to invert Friedrich Hegel's 1770 to 1831 relationship between the individual and the absolute. Whereas for Hegel, the individual was an effect or expression of the absolute. For Feuerbach, the absolute was an effect or expression of the individual. Feuerbach's main works were, Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy, 1839, The Essence of Christianity. 1841, Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, 1843, and The Essence of Religion, 1846. He collaborated with Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and was active in the late 1840s revolutionary period. But then retired from public life and died poor.
What are some highlights of Arthur Schopenhauer's life?
Educated in Germany, Schopenhauer traveled throughout his childhood to France, Holland, Switzerland, Austria, and England. After his father's death, which biographers attribute to suicide, his mother, Johanna Trauner, moved to Weimar and became a celebrated novelist. She introduced Arthur to Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, August Wilhelm Schlegel, and the brothers Grimm. Schopenhauer studied medicine at the University of Göttingen and philosophy at Berlin. Getting his doctorate at the University of Jena. After that, he lived in Frankfurt. His doctoral dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, 1813, formed the basis of his philosophy, which appeared systematically in his most important work, The World as Will and Representation, 1818.
What were Hippocrates' accomplishments and influence?
In founding his own school, Hippocrates, 465 to 370 B. CE, formally established medicine as distinct from theurgy, natural magic, and philosophy. He himself had learned medicine from his father and grandfather. According to the Hippocratic school, illness was caused by an imbalance of four humors that were supposed to be equal in the body: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Every disease progressed to a crisis, from which either death or natural recovery would ensue. Hippocratic medical practice was passive because it was believed that the body would heal itself given rest and immobilization. The therapy was always gentle, and usually only clean water, wine, or bombs were used. Being able to predict the course of an illness was considered important. In his On the Physician, Hippocrates stressed good grooming and a sober demeanor for doctors. It was important to keep records, not only about the patient but also about the patient's family and circumstances. Mystical causes of illness were dismissed. After Hippocrates' death, there was little advancement in the principles attributed to him, and some of his professional rules, such as taking case histories and keeping records, fell into disuse.
Who was C. I. Lewis?
C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, was the most Kantian of all the pragmatists. Although he did not become a pragmatist until he read Charles Sanders Peirce's, 1839 to 1914, papers. When he was given an office in the library room where they were stored at Harvard. Lewis was born in Stoneham, Massachusetts. His father was a shoemaker who became barred from employment due to union activism. Lewis attended Harvard as an undergraduate and returned to get his Ph.D. there. After teaching in Colorado, he then went through the tenure process at the University of California and became well known for his work in symbolic logic. But he gave up his position as associate professor there to be an assistant professor in the Harvard Department of Philosophy in 1920, where he remained until 1953, serving twice as chair. Lewis was the most famous philosopher of his generation during the 1940s. But he had become obscure by the 1960s, largely due to the success of his student W.V. Quine. 1908 to 2000, Quine's success was largely based on the widespread acceptance of his refutation of the analytic/synthetic distinction, which was the cornerstone of Lewis' entire philosophical edifice. Lewis' main works are A Survey of Symbolic Logic, 1918, Symbolic Logic, 1932, which was written with C. H. Lanford, Mind and the World Order, 1929. An Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation, 1946, and The Ground and Nature of the Right, 1965.
What was John Dewey's metaphysics?
Dewey held that nature has different transactions, or kinds of action, that have mutual causes and effects between or among their components. Dewey's transactions are thus interactions. There are three evolutionary levels, or plateaus, of transactions: physiochemical, psychophysical, and human experience. Physiochemical reactions are simply what can be studied by physics and chemistry. Psychophysical transactions are connections between mind and body. Human experience is exactly how things seem to human beings as they go about their lives.
What was alchemy?
The Latin motto of alchemy was Solve et coagula, which means separate and combine. Alchemy was practiced throughout the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish world until the 19th century and beyond. Traditionally, the central project of practicing alchemists was to discover how to turn base metals into gold. Second to this was a search for the elixir of life, which would cure all sickness and enable immortality. Medieval alchemists sought a philosopher's stone, which they believed would make both tasks possible. And they also worked on formulas for a universal solvent or aqua vitae. One form of aqua vitae has endured as a concentrated ethanol liquid, ethyl alcohol.
Was military invasion of Europe part of the religious practice of Islam during the medieval period?
Yes, but the Islamic religion was not opposed to Christianity. In fact, as one of three great religions of the book, Islam had much in common with Christianity, as well as Judaism. Its doctrine included a belief in one God, the importance of prayer, the idea of a church or brotherhood for all members of the religion, and the obligation to care for the poor. What was distinctive about Islam, in comparison to Christianity, was its rejection of the idea of the Catholic Trinity. Requirements of fasting and other forms of bodily purification on holy days, and the necessity for every Muslim follower to make at least one journey or pilgrimage to Mecca. The continual importance of God and homage to Old Testament prophets was shared with Judaism. Although, unlike Judaism, Islam had a positive conception of heaven.
What was Richard Rorty's concept of philosophy?
Rorty, 1931–2007, viewed philosophy as an ongoing free conversation or exchange of ideas that might be pursued passionately but nonetheless could not arrive at a kind of truth that did not exist. Philosophy was an opportunity to creatively reinvent oneself. Although he continually expressed liberal views, he did not think a rational view of universal human rights was possible to construct, but that empathy and related sentiments could be cultivated by reading literature and through the right early education.
What was René Descartes' problem with the Inquisition?
Descartes never had a direct problem with the Inquisition, but he was always afraid of church authorities, and at the same time he wanted their approval. His book on cosmology and physics, which was in accord with both atomism and Copernicanism, was ready to publish, when he withdrew it after he heard of the Inquisition's condemnation of Galileo. In 1637, Descartes published his Optics, Meteorology, and Geometry that was prefaced with Discourse. On the method of rightly conducting one's reason and reaching the truth in the sciences, 1637. Here, Descartes developed his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. An idea was clear if one could be sure about what the idea was, and distinct, if it was different from other ideas. He next published his Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641. Partly in response to criticism he had received on the Discourse on Method, 1637. The discourse explained Descartes' new way of deriving the first principles of the sciences from a few clear and distinct ideas. The Meditations was published with a set of objections and replies from his contemporaries, including Marin Mersenne, 1588–1648, Thomas Hobbes 1588–1679, and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. And it went to a second edition in 1642. It was a completely original work in its claims that it was possible to be certain about the nature of physical reality and the existence of God based on certainty about one's own existence. Descartes' pre-publication discussions led to refinements in his position that related his ideas to the intellectual concerns of his peers. From these discussions, the Meditations became one of the most famous philosophical works. Philosophers still obsess about it in the 21st century. Descartes became increasingly concerned about intellectual attacks on him by papal authorities. His friends thought that he exaggerated the personal and professional dangers of these attacks. But Descartes' own ambition was tied up with his response to them. His thinking went to the heart of the Catholic Church's use of skepticism to deny the findings of the new science that contradicted church doctrine and scripture. It was Descartes' hope that the Jesuits would approve his ideas in the Meditations and even use it as a textbook. Descartes' next publication was Principles of Philosophy, 1644. Which he believed would be a masterpiece that would gain the Church's approval.
Did Plato change his philosophy as he grew older?
Plato became more conservative in his outlook and more attentive to existing social values and traditions as he aged. The city of the Republic would have required a revolution to set up. In the later laws, Plato becomes less revolutionary and describes a second-best city in which there are traditional families and rulers are elected, rather than specially bred. In the Parmenids, Plato offers a series of criticisms to his earlier theory of forms, which he is apparently unable to answer and which are later taken up by Aristotle. The most famous of these is the third-man argument. Suppose we discover a form that accounts for what makes similar things similar. For example, every cat is different, but all cats share the same catness because they participate in the cat form. Now, if we compare this form with any one thing that participates in it in this case, compare your cat with the cat form, the form and the participating thing will have similarities that make it necessary to posit a second form. If we then make comparisons of the cat to the second form, a third form will need to be posited, and on and on and on to an infinite regress. That is, Plato was aware of the theoretical problems with his theory of forms.
What was Bernard Bosanquet's idealist doctrine?
Bosanquet acknowledged a tremendous debt to Friedrich Hegel's, 1770–1831, notion of the absolute and was modest about his own contributions to Hegelian philosophy, although they were a significant departure. According to Bosanquet, contradictions occur in experiences when there are opposing views of the same fact. Truth is attained by eliminating such contradictions by incorporating them into a larger picture. The totality of human experience contains all of such truths, and that is the absolute. It can be seen from this that Bosanquet had an empiricist interpretation of Hegel, a view that itself was a contradiction. Bosanquet also held that the absolute contains all conflicting desires and satisfies all of them. The value of anything lies in its ability to satisfy desires. So the absolute is the standard of all values. We can best realize all of our desires by surrendering our particular forms of them to the absolute. This surrender is religious consciousness.
What were Descartes' main ideas and passions of the soul?
René Descartes claimed that his mind or soul feels passions, or sensations and pains, in the body. The soul is therefore connected to all parts of body, although there is one part of the brain, namely the pineal gland, where it exercises its functions more particularly than elsewhere. That is, the soul directly affects the body through the pineal gland by setting animal spirits in motion, via the will. Descartes thought that the will was infinite because it was a copy of God's will. But that human understanding is limited. Because the will often outstrips the understanding, all manner of human evils and misfortunes follow. Consciousness, or the representation in the mind of the sensation and pains in the body, was unique to human beings, according to Descartes. He thought that animals lacked both a pineal gland and consciousness, and were therefore mere machines.
What are these various specializations and subfields of philosophy?
Various specializations of philosophy and their subject matters include: ethics, how human beings ought to behave in matters involving human well-being or harm; philosophy of science, answers to questions of what science is, how science progresses, and the nature of scientific truth; social and political philosophy, accounts of how society and government work as institutions, what their purposes should be, how they came into being as institutions and how their problems can be fixed. Epistemology, answers to questions about what knowledge is. How we know that something is true, and the relation between sense perception and abstract truths. Metaphysics, the most general questions and answers about the nature of reality, what physical things are. What relations exist between different kinds of things, and the connections between the mind and the world. Philosophy of mind, how the mind works, whether it is dependent on the brain. How it is connected to the body, the nature of memory and personal identity. Aesthetics, the study of art toward an understanding of what beauty is and how artworks are different from natural things and other man-made objects. Ancient philosophy, the birth of Western philosophy from about 800 BCE to 400 CE. It is composed mostly of Greek and Roman thought before Christianity. Medieval philosophy, the development of philosophical thought. From about 400 CE until the Renaissance in the 1300s in Europe, in which Christianity provided the dominant worldview and organizing principle for daily life. Modern philosophy, the foundations of contemporary philosophy from the 1600s through the 1800s. 19th century philosophy, the classical period of modern philosophy, in which Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, and John Stuart Mill wrote. Analytic philosophy, style of professional philosophy, which is abstract and technical, that developed during the 20th century. Postmodern philosophy, school of thought that, in the second half of the 20th century, consisted of reactions against many of the shared assumptions held by philosophers over the centuries.
What were Plato's main ideas as presented and developed in his early dialogues?
The early dialogues are very argumentative, and they display the Socratic method. Socrates is the main character, who begins by asking a question. Conclusions are not reached so much as questions are raised and clarified. The subject is morality, beginning with shared values such as piety or justice, and then demonstrating how little is really known about them. In the Meno, Socrates plies his questions toward the more positive end of showing how knowledge is innate in the soul. Meno is an uneducated slave boy from whom Socrates extracts knowledge of geometry through a series of skillful questions. Socrates concludes that because the soul acquired knowledge before birth, what we know is not learned, but recollected.
How did Friedrich Nietzsche's life presage his philosophy?
The great irony is that in life Nietzsche was very unlike his heroes. Either those of the aristocratic past that he so admired, or of the new age of knowledge and courage that he heralded. His life began in a somewhat sheltered way in Prussia. His father, a Lutheran minister and the son of a Lutheran minister, died when he was 4 of what the doctors called softening of the brain. His mother, Franziska, was only 18 when Friedrich was born. She was the daughter of a Lutheran minister. Contrary to Nietzsche's belief that his forebears were Polish noblemen, many of them were butchers. When Nietzsche was 6, his younger brother died, and he, his mother, and his sister moved to Naumburg. Nietzsche grew up in a household consisting of his mother and sister, his paternal grandmother, and 2 unmarried aunts. Biographers have remarked that this all-family environment was detrimental to his psychological health as an adult. They have referred to this environment in trying to make sense of the hostility Nietzsche displayed toward women in some of his writings, such as this from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883–1885. When thou goest to woman, take thy whip. At boarding school, Nietzsche suffered from migraines. He was inspired by the poetry of Johann Hölderlin, who had gone insane. So this was not considered a healthy subject by Nietzsche's teachers. Nietzsche studied theology and classical philology at the University of Bonn, but only philology at the University of Leipzig. He served briefly in the army from 1867 to 1868, and was discharged after a chest injury, which was incurred when he landed on the pommel of his saddle while mounting. When he was only 24, his teachers considered him so promising that he was appointed associate professor of classical philology at Basel. Nietzsche moved to Basel, became a Swiss subject, and, in 1869, a full professor. In 1870 he received leave to serve as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. Returning to Basel with both dysentery and diphtheria, he received his doctorate in 1873 and resigned from his academic position in 1879 for health reasons. After that, he continued to write and to travel for 9 years.
What are some details of David Hume's life and career?
Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711. His father was a distant relative of the Earl of Home, and his mother's close relatives were lawyers. David was expected to study law, but he didn't like it and left Edinburgh University when he was 15 to read and think about philosophy. He subjected himself to years of intense study, and in 1734 was under a doctor's care for ailments of body and spirit. This was followed by a philosophical breakthrough, as well as work for a merchant in Bristol. He then spent 3 years at La Flèche, René Descartes, 1596–1650, Old School. Hume anonymously published a treatise of human nature in 1739. This work was ignored by other intellectuals, and Hume himself later described it as having fallen stillborn from the press. In hopes of greater recognition, Hume was consumed by what he called love of literary fame. He composed an abstract of a treatise of human nature. which was anonymously published in 1740. His next major philosophical work was Philosophical Essays Concerning the Human Understanding. 1748, which was retitled An Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, 1758. Then came An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, 1751. The inquiry was more explicitly anti-religious than the treatise. His Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was probably written during the 1750s. Although published posthumously. With his philosophical research complete, Hume applied himself to history. His History of Great Britain won him great fame and acclaim, economics, ethics, and political philosophy. However, he also tried, although without success, to secure the position of Chair of Philosophy at the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. He was appointed Secretary to General St. Clare for 3 years in 1746, which led him to Brittany and Turin. And he was in charge of the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh for 5 years. Beginning in 1752. He was then private secretary to the British ambassador in Paris and Under Secretary of State.
What is the they?
Martin Heidegger's term the they was meant to refer to ordinary people who go about their everyday lives with no philosophical awareness of their existence.
Who were some of Robert Boyle's scientific influences?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, and Walter Charlton, 1619–1707, influenced Boyle. In 1656 Charlton brought Gassendi's ideas about atoms to England with his Physiologia Epicuro Gassendo Chartonia, or, a Fabric of Science Natural, upon the hypothesis of atoms. Founded by Epicurus, repaired by Petrus Gassendus, augmented by Walter Charlton, 1654. Charlton revised Gassendi's view that everything, including the soul, was made up of material atoms. This view entailed that the soul was a physical thing, which was against the beliefs of most theologians and members of the clergy.
Why did Vico oppose Cartesianism?
Vico concluded that René Descartes, 1596–1650, had been too enamored of mathematics and natural philosophy, science, to the neglect or dismissal of art, law, and history as valid fields of knowledge. Vico also did not think that Descartes was right in seeking the same kind of certain knowledge in science that mathematics yielded. In his first book, On the Ancient Italian Knowledge, 1710, Vico argued that Descartes was wrong in holding awareness of his own existence as a first philosophical principle, and in trying to prove God's existence through reason alone. Vico's own view was that the mind does not make itself and for that reason cannot know how it has knowledge of itself. Concerning mathematical and even scientific certainty, Vico did not think we can arrive at it through clear and distinct ideas, as Descartes claimed. He claimed that mathematical knowledge is certainly true because the human mind has created the very standard for mathematical truth, or because we have made mathematics. However, God has made the physical universe, and only He can have certain knowledge about that. Vico did concede that when we do make things in nature, or through scientific experiment, we can gain knowledge from the confirmation of our hypotheses.
What were the ideas of some of the humanist existentialists?
Hans Jonas, 1903 to 1993, was influenced by phenomenology as well as existentialism. But some of his most original work has been directly relevant to environmental concerns and thought about the nature of life. In The Imperative of Responsibility, 1979. He argues for ethical responsibility for the planet to fight the incursions of technology. In The Phenomenon of Life, 1966, he argues against standard biological approaches that objectify living things and seek to explain their behavior via mere chemistry or mechanistic hereditary forces. Jonas' positive thesis is that all life forms, even single cells, have some form of awareness and they strive from their own physicality and perspective on the world. Awareness on a cellular level does not imply the presence of the cogito a mind. It is sufficient if the living entity behaves in a way that enhances its life, or attempts to do so. Emmanuel Levinas, 1905 to 1995, was a French Jewish philosopher who was originally from Lithuania. Levinas criticized the philosophical tradition in which things other than an individual mind are represented to that mind in ideas or some other mental content. He thought that the paradigm for understanding consciousness was the face-to-face interactions between human beings. Such interactions are both particular and indescribable, as well as of inestimable importance. Levinas' main works are Totality and Infinity, 1964, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. 1974, Difference and Transcendence, 1999, and Between Us, 1998. Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, like Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855, had a burning question.
What was Karl Popper's notion of the open society?
Beginning with a criticism of Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, and Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. Popper argued that Plato's philosopher kings represented an unattainable ideal of human wisdom and that Marx was mistaken in believing that human history has a moral dimension. Popper reasoned that rulers are always fallible human beings. Furthermore, Popper rejected historicism, or the view that history is determined by group actions, and holism, or the view that only groups are causal agents in society. He did not think that the social sciences had evidence for either the existence of impersonal forces in history or the view that anything other than individuals could make things happen. Popper did not think it was possible for rulers to predict the consequences of their actions and policies. His grounds for this were the philosophical impossibility of anyone being able to predict the future. In an open society, policies should therefore be undertaken as hypotheses that are open to being proved false. Because rulers were capable of fooling themselves and others about the success of their policies, it should be left up to the people to evaluate whether a program was successful. And if it were assessed unsuccessful, then another program should be instigated, subject to the same corrections. Popper believed that if societies were not open in this way, then totalitarianism and repression of individual liberties would ensue.
What is the distinction between deep and shallow ecology?
According to Arnnes, 1912, shallow ecology is concern of affluent Westerners for their own clean air and water, abundant resources, and beautiful scenery. Deep ecology, by contrast, is based on biospheric egalitarianism, or the inherent value to all natural beings of their own existence, shared equally by them all. Nice envisioned the world as a total field or biospherical net in which individual organisms are related to the whole of their environments. As individuals, human beings, for example, are mere knots in the net and ought to forego some of their preoccupation with their own individual existence and selfish interests.
What was Karl Popper's theory of falsification?
Popper, 1902 to 1994, did not think it mattered how hypotheses were inspired or arrived at, so induction was not necessary for their formation. In fact, he thought that the more bold and imaginative a hypothesis, the more scientific it was, because it would be possible to specify what would falsify it. He argued that science progresses through a process of falsification, or, if hypotheses withstand crucial tests, then corroboration, but never confirmation. Hypotheses or theories that cannot be falsified, such as religious, Marxist, or Freudian claims, according to Popper, could never qualify as scientific claims.
Why did philosophers become interested in mathematics, geometry, and logic during the 19th century?
Philosophers have always been interested in these subjects. But in the 19th century there were even more innovations in science and technology than before. Changes in the world had an invigorating effect on higher learning, and philosophers took an interest in new research in the sciences and mathematics. Logic had been a philosophical subject since Aristotle, so new forms of logic were of interest to many philosophers who were not logicians.
How did Nicolaus Copernicus change the world?
Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, changed how educated human beings viewed the world by constructing the heliocentric theory of Earth's relation to our Sun. According to the heliocentric theory, which is now considered common knowledge, Earth and the other planets revolve around the Sun. This heliocentric theory replaced the Ptolemaic geocentric theory, which held that the Sun and other planets revolve around Earth. Copernicus became dissatisfied with the Ptolemaic system after his travels in Italy at a time when there was a lively revival of interest in ancient Pythagorean theories about the metaphysical importance of number for all aspects of nature. The Ptolemaic system was not mathematically elegant, but in Copernicus' day the Church subscribed to the Ptolemaic theory, because that was the description of the cosmos given in the Bible.
What was the dial?
The name for this publication was suggested by Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799 to 1888, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882. The simile was explained in the first issue this way. And so with diligent hands and good intent we set down our dial on the earth. We wish it may resemble that instrument in its celebrated happiness, that of measuring no hours but those of sunshine. Let it be one cheerful rational voice amidst the din of mourners and polemics. Or to abide by our chosen image, let it be such a dial, not as the dead face of a clock. Hardly even such as the gnomon in a garden, but rather such a dial as is the garden itself, in whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived and arriving. The dial became dormant in 1844, but was revived for a year in 1860. In 1880 it reappeared as a political magazine, and in 1920 as a literary modernist magazine, publishing essays, poetry, and art reviews until 1929.
How were virtue ethics rediscovered in analytic philosophy?
Aristotelian virtue ethics, mainly as expressed in Aristotle's 384 to 322b. CE. Nicomachean ethics, were revisited in analytic philosophy to create rationalist moral systems. According to Aristotle, We develop our individual virtues through a rational process of deliberating and then choosing what to do in action. The revival of Aristotelian ethics was sometimes pursued in opposition to other prominent moral systems and moral theories. Philippa Foot, 1920, and Alastair MacIntyre, 1929, are noteworthy 20th-century virtue ethicists.